Okay, every year we do a story called the Pasteboard Star, and it was written by Margaret Carpenter. This is the Pasteboard Star. Gregory curled himself in as small a space as possible, pulled the bedclothes over his head. His breath made a safe, warm little cave under the covers, which shut out the larger darkness around him and made him forget that he was afraid. It was the way he had gone to sleep ever since Aunt Martha had taken him out of the nursery and given him a room to himself, because he was big enough to begin to grow up. The cave made it all right, made it so he didn't mind not being able to hear Christopher talking to himself or Alan singing tunes under his breath that were not tunes at all. At first he made believe he was a lion or a bear, going to sleep out of doors, but soon he began telling himself stories. They were not word stories like the ones in books, but picture stories. Pictures of things happening, and sometimes, when they were very good, not even pictures, but the things themselves. Always, when they were done, he felt warm and tingly and happy, and it seemed as if there were a light in the cave, and as if his mother were there, nodding and smiling at him because he had done something brave and beautiful. And then he was asleep. Tonight, it was different. He had something very important to do, something that he simply had to do before he could go to sleep. It had begun at supper. He still had supper with Christopher and Alan because his father almost never came home for dinner. Almost never come home before he went to bed. In fact, because his father was a doctor and sick people couldn't wait, but children could. Tonight they had hoped perhaps he might get home, and they had been waiting, and Aunt Martha was cross because she had too much to do. He really didn't mind much about Aunt Martha. She was like the weather. You had to take her as she was and just not listen. Maybe she'd be better tomorrow. Christopher had started it. Aunt Martha had gone out of the room on business of her own, and they were alone. He had pushed his chair back because the nursery table hurt his knees. Christopher was spilling milk down his sweater as usual, and Alan was making islands out of his oatmeal. Listen, Greg, do you really remember her? It was funny how Christopher seemed to know sometimes just what people were thinking about. Sure I do, he had answered. Tell me something. Well, she wore a white dress and she carried a baby. You? No, I guess it was Alan. I made 2 islands, said Alan, who never paid attention to anything except what he himself was doing. It couldn't have been Alan. I heard Aunt Martha telling Sadie about how she died before Alan was born. Silly, how could she? Isn't she Alan's mother too? Well, anyway, she never saw Alan because she died in a hospital and never came home. Not hospital, hospital. Maybe it was me she carried. All right, it was you. Go on, tell something else. Well, she wore a white dress. Then Christopher had said that awful thing. You mean like the picture in the dining room? It was like the picture in the dining room. It must have been that the fear had shown in his face, because Christopher had shouted, "You're making it up! You don't remember any more than I do. You're making it up out of the picture." I'm not making it up. I'm not. He had said it fiercely. Because of the queer feeling in his stomach, I see her in, he had been going to say the cave, but he had pulled himself up in time. It was a secret promise that he would never tell anyone about the cave, because it was queer that when you told things about like that, they never seemed so real afterwards. That was why he ought to not have talked about his mother for now, it seemed. All of a sudden, as if she were not real at all. I see her in the dark, he finished lamely, and she has on a white dress and she smiles at me, and you are making it up. I'm not. Just then Aunt Martha had come in. Boys, can't you stop quarreling even on Christmas Eve? He's telling stories again, said Christopher. He says he sees her in the dark and she has on a white dress. Gregory. He had tried to look back at her, but her eyes frightened him. If he looked at them, they would take away the realness of his mother altogether, and then everything would be spoiled, for it was that feeling about his mother that made him able to grow up, to be more like his father and sleep by himself and not mind about Aunt Martha being cross. Christopher and Alan were babies. They didn't remember, but he did, and now they were trying to take his remembering away from him, and he was afraid. "Where's Daddy?" asked Alan brightly, just as if nothing had happened. "I want him to draw a boat." "I'm sure I don't know where your father is." Aunt Martha's voice was high, the way it got when she was tired. "But we can't wait any longer. You will hang up your stockings and go to bed." When she sounded like that, there was no use hoping about anything anymore. And here he was, all curled up in the cave and didn't care whether it was Christmas Eve or not, because he had to remember. He simply had to remember before he could go to sleep. Downstairs there were people moving about and a faint murmur of voices. His father had come home and they were trimming the tree. Every Christmas Daddy and Aunt Martha trimmed the tree. He knew that, but Christopher and Alan didn't. Santa Claus was a game Aunt Martha played, and he wouldn't spoil it, not for anything. He liked to play it, only why didn't Aunt Martha ever like to play his games? He screwed up his eyes real tight. He wasn't getting anywhere. He was thinking as if his mother's realness was a game, and it wasn't. It was really real, just not a pretend, like Santa Claus. And he must remember something that even Aunt Martha would know was real, before he could go to sleep. He tried to make his mind very still and empty so that he could remember the very first thing. "No, you must tie your shoes yourself. You are a big boy now." He remembered that. Sunlight in a room and someone kneeling in front of him. Was it his mother? Someone in a white dress? But it sounded like Aunt Martha's voice. "Now you are a big boy. You must sleep in a room by yourself." No, it was Aunt Martha. Always Aunt Martha. The cave was dark and there was no one there but Aunt Martha. Supposing they were right and he didn't remember. He popped his head out from under the bedclothes. For the first time he was afraid in the cave, and the room was so very dark and he was afraid there too. He must not call because that would wake up Christopher and Alan. Only he was so much afraid that he would have to do something about it quickly. He jumped out of bed and very carefully opened the door. Perhaps, if he could hear his father's voice, it would make everything all right again. It was dark in the hall, but just at the foot of the stairs a warm, lovely glow streamed out from the library door. They were in there trimming the tree. He sat down on top of the step, on the top step of the stairs, curling and uncurling his toes against the carpet. They are frightfully tarnished, and the tinsel is all matted. "I'll get new ones next year." That was Aunt Martha. Then his father answered, only it wasn't exactly an answer, which was the way his father often did. "I had a hard time finding candle holders. Everybody uses electricity, apparently. Of course, it is much safer. Well, I like real candles. Will you hand me one of those, angels, please?" He knew he ought not to listen, but he moved down a few steps. It wasn't as if they were saying anything important. All he wanted was to hear his father's voice. Hang it just the same. Never mind. Hang it just the same. Perhaps his father hadn't heard. He was like that sometimes. You had to say a thing or two or three times before he answered. He dug his toes into the carpet and waited. What was it about Gregory? His father's voice sounded so gentle as if he thought he were going to hear something pleasant. "I'm having a difficult time with him. He is turning into a regular little liar, and I can't seem to get a hold of him at all. He simply doesn't seem to distinguish truth from fiction." Silence again. Gregory sat very still, only his heart was pounding so terribly. It seemed as if they must hear it. "What sort of lies?" He tells the children the most impossible stories. Tells them that he killed a tiger on the stairs and how he stopped a runaway on the way back from school. That's not exactly lying, is it? Not lying. Well, there wasn't any tiger, and he certainly did not stop a runaway. No, but if there had been a tiger, he would have wanted to kill it. And if he had seen a runaway, he would have imagined himself stopping it just as you or I would. Well, whatever you call it, it has got to stop. It is giving Alan nightmares now. Now he has begun on something else. There was the sound of a match. His father was lighting his pipe. He has begun, said Aunt Martha, to tell stories about his mother. There was a long, long silence. Gregory pressed up close against the banisters. He had a horrid feeling. It was just as if he were a rag doll and they had him in there passing him about, poking him and pulling him, and he could not make a sound. What sort of stories? Well, tonight he said he saw her in the dark. Gregory stood up. He could not stay and he could not go, and something was going to happen. Perhaps, said his father slowly, he wishes she were there in the dark. That is very different from telling the children that he sees her. It's not wholesome. Will you hand me the top piece to the tree, please? Aunt Martha's voice was a little high. There was the tissue paper sound again. No, not that. That's nothing but a pasteboard star. It looks like a kindergarten toy. I mean that tall spike for the top of the tree. Gregory closed his eyes. Something very queer was happening inside himself. He felt as if he were going to be sick. Try the star, said his father. But look, the silver paper is peeling off, and one of the points is... Afterward, Gregory could remember nothing except that one minute he had been holding on to the banisters and feeling as if he were going to be sick, and the next he had been standing right there between them and shouting at them. I do remember. I made that star and my mother cut it out and we pasted the paper on it and I sucked a red ribbon so that it would go through the hole and she lifted me up so I could hang it and you got to hang it. You got to hang it. Aunt Martha was standing on a chair staring down at him and her mouth was open and suddenly he pointed his finger at her. I do remember and you're a liar and you get out of here. This is my tree and my mother's tree and you get out. Get out. Hush, Greg, said his father very quietly, and laid his hand on his shoulder. Everything seemed to be swimming a little, as if he were in the middle of a soap bubble and it was going to burst. I never in my life heard a child speak so to an older person, said Aunt Martha in a shaky voice. I'll handle this, said his father. He was helping her off the chair. Gregory stood alone by the tree. It was very beautiful. It moved a little as if it were in a wind. He heard the door close and his father was beside him. He was going to tell him what a dreadful boy he had been. He was going to handle it himself, and that had never happened before. His father was picking up something from the floor and he was putting it into his hands. It was the pasteboard star. Here, Greg, he said. Here. You hang it. You climb up and hang it yourself. He climbed on the chair and hung it as high as he could. It was pretty high, one of the little branches next to the top. It twisted slowly on its red ribbon. It made him dizzy to watch it, so that he put out his hand to his father's shoulder. Suddenly, their arms were around each other. Because he was on the chair and so very tall, it made him seem as if he were grown up and his father the little boy. He laid his cheek against his father's head so that he could hear what he was saying. Greg, I didn't know about you remembering. I didn't know. We'll neither of us have to be alone again. The end.